This documentary is presented to you in the form of an audiobook. Did you know that the man who wrote against capitalism actually lived off profits from a Manchester factory? Or that the philosopher who inspired communist revolutions tried to dedicate his masterpiece to Charles Darwin, Karl Marx? You think you know his story, but the truth is far more shocking. In the next 10 minutes, you'll discover why governments spied on him for decades, how his own family paid the ultimate price for his ideas, and why his predictions about artificial intelligence and automation are eerily accurate today. These aren't just historical facts, they're revelations that will transform how you see the modern world. Get ready to meet the real Karl Marx. For over a century, Karl Marx has been portrayed as either a prophetic hero or a dangerous radical. His books, Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, sparked revolutions that reshaped entire continents. Yet behind these world-changing works lies an untold story. Through newly uncovered letters, police records, and personal documents, we've pieced together the true story of a complex genius who struggled with poverty, fought against illness, and sacrificed everything for his research. A story that proves more gripping than any myth or propaganda. Forget what you think you know about Karl Marx. The real story begins now. Fact 1. The poet who became a revolutionary. Before he shook the foundations of economic theory, Karl Marx was pursuing a radically different path. At the University of Berlin, this brilliant young scholar immersed himself not in politics or economics, but in ancient Greek philosophy. His passion, understanding how the atoms of Democritus and the materialism of Epicurus could challenge traditional religious beliefs. In 1841, his doctoral dissertation would reveal the first glimpses of his revolutionary mindset. Writing to his father, Marx declared his mission to hunt down the false gods of religion and state. This wasn't just academic research, it was intellectual rebellion. In his private notebooks, alongside complex philosophical arguments, lay something unexpected. Pages of romantic poetry and creative writing that showed a young mind wrestling with the biggest questions of existence. But this promising academic career was about to implode. The Prussian government's crackdown on radical thinkers would force Marx to choose between conformity and rebellion. His decision would change the course of history and lead him down a path of hardship few could have imagined. Fact 2. The price of greatness. In 1850, Marx and his family arrived in London as political refugees. They found shelter in 2 small rooms in Soho, where the true cost of his revolutionary ideas would be paid not in political persecution, but in innocent lives. Jenny von Westphalen, his aristocratic wife who gave up her privileged life for love, bore 6 children in these squalid conditions. Their story turned tragic. As Marx worked on his economic theories, his son Heinrich, just 9 years old, succumbed to tuberculosis in 1850. 2 years later, in 1852, his daughter Franziska, barely a year old, died of bronchitis. 2 more children would follow them to the grave, victims of the very poverty their father was dedicating his life to understand and fight against. Jenny wrote in her diary, "The poor children's illnesses stemmed mainly from the anxieties of domestic life and the terrible times we had to endure. Yet even as his family crumbled around him, Marx was about to find an unlikely sanctuary that would change everything." Fact 3. The secret sanctuary. While his family struggled in Soho's slums, Marx found an unexpected refuge in the majestic reading room of the British Museum. Reader's ticket number 1584 tells an astounding story. For over 3 decades, Marx would arrive at opening time and leave only when forced out at closing. Surviving records show he devoured everything, from factory inspection reports to books on calculus, technological patents to agricultural chemistry. His notebooks filled with 33,000 pages of meticulous research notes in multiple languages. Here, surrounded by the finest library in the world's most powerful empire, Marx pieced together the brutal mechanics of how that empire's wealth was created. Engels would later write, "Without the British Museum's resources, Das Kapital would never have been completed." But in these endless hours of study, Marx was uncovering something far more explosive than just economic theory. Fact 4. The Scientific Mastermind. Few know that amid his political writings, Marx harboured an obsession that consumed his later years, the cutting-edge science of his era. In 1860, when Darwin's Origin of Species was published, Marx excitedly wrote to Engels, "This is the book that contains the natural history foundation for our view." But his scientific pursuit went far deeper. In private notebooks discovered years later, we find hundreds of pages filled with complex calculus equations and differential formulas. Marx believed that mathematics could reveal the hidden laws of economic change, just as Newton's laws explained planetary motion. He even drafted a letter to Darwin, hoping to dedicate Volume 2 of Das Kapital to the great scientist. But what Marx discovered in his scientific studies would lead him to an even more radical conclusion, one that would predict the technological revolutions of our own time. Fact 5. The Undercover Journalist. Few realize that the author of Das Kapital was also the European correspondent for America's most widely read newspaper. From 1852 to 1862, Marx wrote over 350 articles for the New York Daily Tribune, becoming one of their highest-paid foreign journalists. His dispatches weren't just about European politics, they spanned the globe. When the American Civil War erupted, Marx provided some of the most insightful analysis of its economic causes. His articles on British colonialism in India predicted the long-term consequences of imperial exploitation. Writing under various pseudonyms, he exposed corruption in the British government and the hidden horrors of industrial capitalism. But his sharp pen and sharper insights weren't just earning him a living, they were attracting the attention of the world's most powerful secret police forces. Marx's journalism was about to make him one of the most closely watched men in Europe. Fact 6. The most dangerous man in Europe. By 1850, Marx had become the most closely watched political refugee in London. Recently declassified police archives reveal the extraordinary extent of this surveillance. The Prussian secret police maintained a network of spies whose sole task was monitoring his movements. French agents filed daily reports on his activities. Even Britain's Home Office kept a thick dossier on the dangerous German scholar. In one intercepted letter, a Prussian spy wrote, "Doctor, Marx is the moving spirit of the entire revolutionary movement. His private life is filled with writing and organizing." The authorities were right to be concerned. Despite their best efforts, Marx had created an underground network of correspondence that stretched from London's refugee communities to revolutionary circles across Europe. What these anxious police agents couldn't know was that their very surveillance would help Marx understand something crucial about state power, an insight that would shape his most radical theories. Fact 7. The Puppet Master of Revolution. In 1864, from a modest flat at 28 Dean Street, Marx launched what would become the first global working-class movement. The International Working Men's Association began with just a few dozen labour activists in a small London pub. Within months, it had spread to almost every country in Europe. The police who had watched him for years were stunned. Their reports reveal the scale of his network: secret printing presses in Switzerland, underground workers' groups in Paris, trade unions in Berlin, and revolutionary cells in Brussels. Marx wrote hundreds of letters, drafted manifestos and coordinated strikes across borders, all while completing Das Kapital. A Prussian spy reported in alarm, "In Marx's hands, the International has become a force that makes ministers tremble." But even as his organization grew in power, Marx was developing theories that would far outlive both the International and himself. Fact 8. The Man Who Saw Tomorrow. In the dusty pages of Das Kapital, written over 150 years ago, Marx made predictions about our modern world that are startlingly accurate. In Chapter 15, he described how machines would increasingly replace human workers, creating what he called a surplus population of unemployed. Today, as artificial intelligence threatens millions of jobs, his words read like tomorrow's headlines. But his most remarkable forecast was about globalization. Marx wrote, "The need of a constantly expanding market chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe." He predicted how capital would break down all national barriers, create a world market, and transform traditional societies through what we now call globalization. Even more striking was his analysis of economic crises. His description of credit-fueled boom and bust cycles eerily foreshadowed the 2008 financial crisis. But Marx saw something else coming, a fundamental change in how capitalism would adapt and survive. Fact 9. The code breaker of capitalism. Unlike his followers, Marx never saw capitalism as a fragile system destined for quick collapse. In his private notebooks, the Grundrisse, discovered decades after his death, he revealed a deeper truth. Capitalism's greatest strength was its ability to constantly revolutionize itself. He predicted how banks and credit would evolve to rescue capitalism from its crises. In Das Kapital, he described how smaller companies would be swallowed by larger ones, leading to what we now call corporate monopolies. Writing in 1858, he outlined how capitalism would spread to every corner of the globe, creating what he called the world market. Most remarkably, in manuscripts that remained unpublished for a century, Marx described how capitalism would survive by turning everything, even information and human creativity, into commodities. But his most prophetic insight was yet to come, one that speaks directly to our age of artificial intelligence. Fact 10. The Profit of AI. In Chapter 15 of Das Kapital, Marx wrote words that could have been written about today's AI revolution. The machine does not free the worker from work, but rather deprives the work itself of all content. His analysis went beyond simple automation. He saw how technology would fundamentally transform the nature of work itself. In manuscripts written in the 1850s, he described how machines would not only replace physical labor, but would begin to take over intellectual work as well. He predicted that as technology advanced, workers would become mere appendages of the machine, their skills constantly devalued by each new innovation. Most prophetically, he foresaw that this wouldn't be a temporary disruption, but a permanent feature of technological capitalism. As he wrote, "Capital itself is the moving contradiction, in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time as sole measure and source of wealth." Today, as artificial intelligence threatens to reshape our entire economy, Marx's analysis feels more relevant than ever before. A German refugee who lost his children to poverty, a scholar who spent 3 decades in the British Museum, a journalist whose words were feared by governments, a scientist who sought to understand the laws of social change. This was the real Karl Marx. Neither demon nor saint, Marx emerges from the historical record as something far more compelling. A brilliant mind who sacrificed everything to understand the forces shaping our world. His personal tragedies, his scientific approach, and his global vision produced insights that still illuminate our present. As artificial intelligence and automation transform our economy once again, perhaps it's time to look beyond the myths and truly understand this complex thinker's legacy.